Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Everag Global Insights. And Steve, we've got a bit of background today, just in the lead up to this GDT event this week that was a positive one, the first one for a while. We'll go through the results of GDT event 353, and then we've, of course, got Chart of the Week, and it's a ripper.
Joe, just looking here at some of the background futures markets, what we've seen recently, skimmer powder futures both in New Zealand and US, and Europe looks very similar to this, trended downwards. Cheese in the US being weakening as well, not as dramatic as what we've seen in skimmer powder, but see, these are reasonably healthy falls we've seen. They're continuing because that market still remains volatile. Butter been heading the other way, and the European market has continued to bounce around but remain reasonably tight, and certainly a strong forward curve there. So quite a different setting across those products. So Joe, as we head into this, some things you wanted to remind people about, or some of the background to GDT?
Yeah, there's some things that you highlighted in the GDT wrap this morning, Steve, around some of the context for this positive result. So obviously ingredient prices at the moment are still pretty attractive for buyers. There's been a real clearance of New Zealand stocks. We talked a little bit about that in terms of the trade data last week, and we'll do a little bit more in depth today. More buyers are operating hand to mouth, and that's just a factor of the uncertainty around the demand environment in a lot of these markets. And the butterfat offer volumes on GDT are well down year on year, on top of the fact that we're heading into the seasonally lower volumes on offer anyway on GDT as a whole. In terms of that piece around the stock clearance at low prices, July to February, we've seen a 10% lift in the volumes of whole milk powder exports out of New Zealand. So fairly significant there in terms of clearing product. And then if we look to Southeast Asia, Steve.
Yeah, that's a similar story, but the uplift has been a really strong pickup of volumes in whole milk powder into Southeast Asia, up year on year 19%, nearly 20% better in the season to date, New Zealand season to date. When you see the trend line, it shows we're back above a long-term declining trend. Maybe we're on the way up higher here, Joe, that
we might pull the trend line up. Yeah,
we could pull it up. We have been there before, so the region is not as healthy, but we're on the way back. Maybe that continues.
And then just looking at skim milk powder, Steve, again, monthly exports, 11.5% lift for that same period from July through to February. Again, a big clearance sale of those ingredient stocks. And what's behind that? Southeast Asia again?
Southeast Asia's not much of that change. Really, the Middle East has been a big part of that into regions which picked up more. But in Southeast Asia, heavier buyers on GDT, and so while we're looking at these things, not a big change there, but it's on the way back, I guess you could say. So, Joe, the second point you wanted to call out here is what's happening with the butterfat offers. And this is a long-term, the percentage that GDT sales represent of New Zealand trade. So you can see the fats are a higher portion, obviously, than ingredients. And when you look at AMF, it's got the highest, 35 to 40%. It's come down a bit, but we're still seeing it's around about a third of all trade is done on GDT. It's very important to understand, but it's just a little bit behind that. So when we then look at what's been going on in the last season, Joe, this is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that dark blue line there, well behind last year. So year on year, the amount of AMF available on the GDT platform that those who choose to buy from there is well down. So a little bit more competition for lower volumes, and that really explains this 15 event streak that we've seen in terms of AMF prices not going down. Butter sales, not quite as dramatic, but still a bit lower year on year in terms of the volume available. So that really does highlight some of the dynamics we've seen on GDT around butterfat in the last few weeks, Steve.
And so when you think of those demand ratios that come out, and we'll look at those,
great,
they're naturally higher because we've got less on offer. The demand, the volumes, or the volumes, if you go back to where it was a year ago, that's essentially the uplift in demand that is still coming to GDT.
Yeah.
So to the event itself.
Yeah, with that background, Steve, and you can see that there's been not a whole lot of movement in some of those ingredient prices.
Yeah, skim essentially at the main volumes. C2 is flat, but some very small increases across other contracts. Whole milk a little stronger. The uplift in fat continues. And cheese, well, it's a lottery. It's trended high, gone back. It's been bouncing around. But yeah, generally there weren't many contracts across the spectrum that fell this time.
Yeah, and just again, providing a bit of context, Steve, we've got spot prices from the CME and also EU quotes. And particularly for skim milk powder, they're all pretty closely clustered there, Steve. Again, cheese out of the US, spot cheese is a real discount to those other benchmark values there. But everything else pretty much in alignment. So what do we know about what happened in terms of that demand piece?
So onto the demand piece, strongly higher. We did look at this at the last event, where there were big changes. And this time we've seen, as the volumes have dropped, we've really seen that butterfat demand spike. A couple of your favourite charts, Joe. I'll leave you tell us about what's going on here.
I love this so much. But again, it is interesting this time around at this event, the starting point well above the last few events. And again, that demand's held on for quite a few rounds. That's for whole milk powder. And certainly for skim milk powder, it's a similar, maybe again less dramatic picture there, but starting very strongly in terms of demand for skim as well. The wrap around the regions, Steve, what are the regional buyer dynamics been like for this event?
So, Joe, this is showing volumes. We leave the index off the side because we're not meant to show that. But just the relative trends on volumes are important here. So here's a positive take. China, with lower offer volumes, did buy more whole milk powder this time around in absolute terms. Bought half on that was on offer. And that's got to be a positive takeaway as the volumes are falling seasonally. In skim milk powder, though, again, unless they're heavily stocked, we think internally. So, not a surprise that they bought less. When we go in the Middle East, Joe, though, this is something we've been talking about a bit in recent times.
Again, not any change really year on year in terms of the absolute volumes bought here by Middle Eastern buyers, a little bit up on the previous event, but again, enough to make those demand factors increase. And then Southeast Asia, whole milk powder sales, again, we feel they're very well stocked. They haven't increased their volumes and they're year on year, and they're down on the previous event. So again, no surprises there really, Steve. Skim milk powder, similar story, down on the previous event and pretty much in line with last year.
There's an old favourite, the discount, the AMF discount, it remains. It's certainly on a trend line there, sloping slightly downwards to the right and staying similarly where it's been. It's still $1,000 a tonne, so significant, which helps the attraction. And when we look at the skim milk powder, where we are with forward prices, they've come together a bit. Still that inflated expectation about where things are going to get to in Europe and in Oceania, with those firmly rising lines, despite the fact we're going to see a bit more milk in Europe, we think, and demand is still pretty lackluster, particularly in the internal markets. Chart of the week, Joe, what have you got?
Well, this week we've actually got, as our gun analyst Vuko said, this is probably chart of the month, and I think you agree with him there, Steve. And given that we haven't talked much about cheese in the GDT context because it's a bit of a lottery, this is a really interesting chart. So this is showing the global cheese trade that we've seen in what we're calling contestable versus other markets. So those contestable markets are the ones where, there's a few players, the US, Europe, New Zealand, and in some instances even Australia might be playing. So Southeast Asia, China, Australia, and North Asia, and also to an extent Middle East and North Africa. And those other markets are the markets where there's less contest, I guess. They're more dominated by a single supplier. So by that we mean Mexico, South America, and North America in terms of that EU-Canada trade. And what's striking there, Steve, is the reduction in actual trade into those contestable markets over the last 12 months or so compared to the trade that's occurred in those less contested markets.
Yeah, and they are the developing regions, right? So they are the important regions we all talk about as regions of the future. So they've been flat for a couple of years. And when we're looking at, the situations of big markets like EU and US needing exports to balance, these are the disappointing parts of their markets because they're struggling. So we are seeing pretty strong competition. Europe has done better at this, and as a consequence, this is what's keeping the US market bouncing around at low levels. Is they've the lack of success in actually penetrating, growing share in very price competitive terms. Yeah, very interesting dynamic that continues to roll on.
Absolutely.
Well done, Joe. And that's all from us. We'll be back again next week.